My girlfriend said I was the love of her life, just not the one she respected. She told me I was the love of her life, just not the one she respected, and by the time I realized what that actually meant, I had lost everything but my dignity. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash the like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Ryan, and I am 26 years old. Looking back at the beginning, I suppose I should have seen the cracks in the foundation, but when you're standing inside a palace built of smoke and mirrors, it is difficult to believe that the structure is anything but solid. I met Sophia during a period of my life where I was establishing my career, trying to find my footing in a new city, and generally feeling like a blank slate waiting to be filled. She was vibrant, chaotic, and overwhelmingly charismatic. The kind of person who walks into a room and immediately demands the oxygen shift in her direction. For a quiet guy like me, who preferred the background to the spotlight, she felt like gravity. I was the moon, and she was the earth, and I was perfectly content to orbit her if it meant I could bask in her light. In the early days, the dynamics of our relationship were established with a subtlety that now chills me to the bone. I was the provider, the fixer, the constant. I paid for every dinner, every trip, every unexpected night out. It wasn't that she didn't have money. She simply operated under the unspoken assumption that her presence was the gift, and my financial contribution was the ticket price to see the show. I happily paid it. I defended her when our friends whispered that she was high maintenance, arguing that they just didn't understand her depth. I apologized when she felt slighted by the waiter, the weather, or the timing of a movie, even when I knew logically that none of those things were my fault. I remember one specific Tuesday evening about 6 months in, a night that should have been a quiet celebration of my new job. Instead, it turned into a 3-hour seminar on my inadequacies. I had prepared a nice meal, bought a bottle of wine she liked, and sat waiting for her to return from work. She arrived 2 hours late, smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't mine, scrolling through her phone with a detached look in her eyes. When I asked her if everything was okay, she didn't look up. She just sighed, a long, exaggerated exhale that seemed to deflate the entire room, and told me that I was suffocating her with my neediness. I had simply asked a question, but in her narrative, my desire for connection was a character flaw, a weakness I needed to eradicate. That night became the blueprint for the next 2 years. I learned that my role was not to be a partner, but to be a reflection of her moods. If she was happy, I was ecstatic. If she was angry, I was the cause. If she was bored, I was dull. I shrank myself to fit into the spaces she left for me, trimming away my hobbies, my opinions, and my boundaries until I was a caricature of the man I used to be. I thought this was what love looked like, sacrifice. I thought that by erasing my own ego to make room for hers, I was being the ultimate boyfriend. I didn't realize that I wasn't building a relationship. I was building a prison where I was both the prisoner and the warden, constantly watching myself for any infraction of her unwritten laws. The trap wasn't set with ropes or chains. It was set with the promise that if I just tried a little harder, loved a little harder, been a little further, she would finally look at me with the respect I craved. The transition from subtle criticism to psychological warfare happened so slowly that I didn't notice the water was boiling until I was already cooked. It started with the gaslighting, a term I would become intimately familiar with later, but at the time, I just called it being wrong. Sophia had a unique talent for rewriting history in real time. She would recount arguments we had days or weeks earlier, altering details to cast herself as the victim and me as the aggressor, and she did it with such conviction that I began to doubt my own memory. I found myself apologizing for things I didn't remember doing, accepting blame for sentiments I didn't hold, just to end the dizzying sensation of being untethered from reality. A central theme of our relationship became my alleged insecurity. Sophia loved to flirt, not just with strangers, but with my friends, my coworkers, and even random men on the street. She called it being friendly or having a sparkling personality. When I would quietly express that it made me uncomfortable, like the time she sat on a male coworker's lap at a holiday party right in front of me, she would pivot instantly. The hurt in my eyes wasn't a valid reaction to her disrespect. It was evidence of my fragile masculinity. She would coo at me, patronizing and sweet, telling me that a confident man wouldn't feel threatened by other men because he would know he was the best. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She created the very insecurity she then criticized me for having. The cycle became predictable. She would cross a line, a boundary I hadn't even known I needed to set until she stepped over it. I would feel a pang of hurt, a whisper of intuition telling me that this wasn't right. I would voice it hesitantly, respectfully, and then she would unleash the fury. It wasn't always screaming. Sometimes it was a cold, calculated silence that lasted for days, a punishment designed to make me feel invisible. Other times it was tears, great, heaving sobs about how I was trying to control her, how I was just like every other man who tried to clip her wings. The guilt would crush me. I would end up comforting her for the pain she had caused me, promising to be better, to be cooler, to be the man she deserved. I remember driving her home one night after she had spent 3 hours at a bar dancing with a group of guys while I sat at a table alone. While I mentioned in the car that I would have liked to dance with her, she laughed. It wasn't a malicious laugh, but a dismissive one, like a parent amused by a child's silly request. She told me that I just didn't have the energy to keep up with her, that I was too domesticated. Those words hung in the air, heavier than any insult. I spent the rest of the night wondering if wanting to hold my girlfriend's hand made me domesticated, if my desire for fidelity made me boring. I began to hate the parts of myself that were gentle, believing that they were the reason she couldn't love me the way I wanted. I didn't understand that her inability to respect me wasn't a reflection of my softness. It was a reflection of her emptiness. The erosion of my self-esteem moved from the private sphere into the public one, slowly stripping away my dignity in front of the people who cared about me. Our friend group, a tight-knit circle that had welcomed me with open arms before Sophia, became the audience for our twisted dynamic. Sophia was the star, and I was the prop she used to elicit laughs or sympathy, depending on the scene she was playing. She would make cutting jokes about my job, my lack of athletic ability, or my sexual performance in mixed company, laughing brightly as if she were just being playful. When the laughter died down and she saw the look of humiliation on my face, she would inevitably claim that I was too sensitive, that she was just roasting the person she loved most, and that I should learn to take a joke. It was a subtle campaign of character assassination. Over time, I noticed the way our friends looked at me changing. They no longer saw me as Ryan, the guy who liked hiking and craft beer. They saw me as Sophia's project, the needy boyfriend who couldn't take a joke and required constant management. I watched, helpless, as she rewrote my personality to fit her narrative. She would tell stories about our arguments, where she was the long-suffering saint dealing with my irrational outbursts, completely fabricating details to make herself look like the victim. Our friends would nod, offering her sympathetic glances while shooting me judgmental looks. I wanted to scream, to stand up on the table and shout that it was all a lie, but the conditioning was too deep. I stayed silent, swallowing the bile rising in my throat, afraid that speaking up would only prove her right. The dynamic reached a breaking point during a weekend trip to a lake house with about 6 other couples. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, but for me, it was a gauntlet. Sophia spent the entire weekend flirting aggressively with one of the other guys there, a guy named Brendan who embodied everything I wasn't. Loud, physically imposing, and arrogant. She hung on his every word, touched his arm constantly, and generally acted as if she were single and on the prowl. When I tried to initiate conversation with her, she would give me one-word answers, barely looking at me, only to light up seconds later when Brendan entered the room. The humiliation culminated on the final night when we were all playing a drinking game. Sophia made a comment about how I wasn't man enough to handle a certain physical challenge, sparking a round of laughter from a group. I felt my face burn hot, a mix of shame and rage. I got up from the table and walked out to the deck to get some air. I expected her to follow me, to apologize, to realize she had gone too far in front of our friends. Instead, she stayed inside. 10 minutes later, when I walked back in, hoping to slip away unnoticed. I heard her telling the room that she had to constantly reassure me because I was so insecure. She had turned my decision to walk away from her cruelty into evidence of my need for coddling. That night, lying in the bed next to her, listening to her breathing steady and calm while I stared at the ceiling, I felt a cold, hard certainty settle in my chest. I was alone in this relationship. I had been for a long time. Following the lake house incident, something inside me shifted. I didn't leave her, not yet. The psychological hold was still too strong, and the fear of being alone was still greater than the pain of being with her. But I stopped fighting for her approval. I stopped trying to defend myself against her accusations. I became a ghost in my own life, going through the motions of our relationship while a part of me observed from a distance, mourning the death of the connection I thought we had. I retreated into myself, pouring my energy into my work and the few solitary hobbies I still enjoyed. It was a survival mechanism, a way to conserve the last shreds of my dignity. Of course, Sophia noticed the change immediately, and she hated it. My indifference was a threat to her control. Without my reaction, her provocations lost their power. When she insulted me, and I just shrugged, she would escalate, screaming louder, trying to provoke a response. When I didn't get jealous about her flirting, she would accuse me of not caring about her, of being emotionally cold and distant. She wanted the dynamic back where she was the sun and I was the desperate planet. She wanted me to beg, but I had no energy left to beg. I was running on fumes. It was during this period of Cold War that she sat me down for the love of my life conversation. We were in the living room of the apartment we shared, a space that felt more like a museum of her preferences than a home. She looked at me with a serious expression, her voice soft and full of what sounded like concern. She told me that she loved me, that I was the love of her life, that she couldn't imagine a future without me. But then, her eyes hardened just a fraction, and she dropped the hammer. She said that while she loved me, she didn't respect me. She told me that respect was earned through strength, through dominance, through the ability to command a room, and that I simply didn't have those qualities. She said she loved how I took care of her, but she couldn't respect a man who let her walk all over him. The words hit me like a physical blow. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me, and the most cruel. She was admitting that the relationship was a transaction. She got my care and resources, and in exchange, I got her contempt. She framed it as constructive criticism, as if she were helping me by telling me that I was fundamentally inadequate as a man. She said that if I could just man up, if I could just be more aggressive, more assertive, then she could finally give me the respect I deserved. It was a final, desperate attempt to shift the blame. If I was unrespectable, then her disrespect of me was my fault, not hers. I sat there, listening to her dissect my character, realizing that she wasn't describing me. She was describing a fantasy she had concocted, a monster she could submit to, and she was angry that I was just a human being. The final act of our tragedy didn't happen in a dramatic, cinematic explosion. It happened quietly, insidiously, while I was at work. Sophia had been spending more and more time out with the girls, nights that would stretch until 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning. When she came home, smelling of smoke and that same expensive cologne I had noticed months ago, she would offer a flimsy excuse and stumble into bed, often pushing me away if I tried to touch her. I knew what was happening. The signs were everywhere, clear as day to anyone who wasn't actively denying reality. But I held onto the silence, afraid that speaking the truth would shatter the fragile glass house we were living in. The confirmation came through a cruel twist of modern technology. One afternoon, I was home early from a meeting. Sophia had left in a hurry, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. It buzzed with a notification. I told myself not to look. I told myself to respect her privacy, to be the bigger person, to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. But the curiosity, mixed with the deep-seated suspicion, was too strong. I walked over to the counter and looked at the screen. It was a message from Brendan. It was a photo, a candid shot of Sophia asleep in a bed that definitely wasn't ours, with the caption, "Still the best I ever had." I felt the blood drain from my face. I felt nauseous, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I unlocked the phone. I knew her passcode, just as she knew mine, and scrolled through the messages. It was worse than I imagined. It wasn't just a drunken mistake. It was a full-blown affair, spanning back months, possibly even to the lake house trip. They mocked me in the texts, laughing at my gullibility, making jokes about my nice guy act. Sophia had told him everything, private details about our relationship, my insecurities, our sex life, turning me into a punchline for her affair partner. Every insecurity she had gaslit me into having was now a weapon she used to bond with him. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the wall, waiting for her to come home. I ran through the scenarios in my head. Would I scream? Would I throw her out? Would I cry? I felt hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was humiliated. Everyone knew. Brendan knew. Their friends likely knew. And I had been walking around like an idiot, paying for her dinners, apologizing for being too sensitive, trying to win the respect of a woman who was laughing at me behind my back. When she finally walked through the door, looking flushed and guilty, carrying a bag of takeout to mask the smell of another man's apartment, I didn't yell. I just looked at her. I held up the phone. I watched the color drain from her face, the performance crumble in an instant. The confrontation was brief, but the aftermath was a war I hadn't prepared to fight. When faced with undeniable proof, Sophia didn't collapse in apology. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She pivoted instantly to the offensive. She told me that my snooping was a violation of her privacy, a toxic trait that proved I was the problem. She said that she had sought comfort elsewhere because I was emotionally unavailable, because I had checked out of the relationship months ago. She twisted the knife deeper, telling me that a real man would have fought for her, that my weakness had driven her into the arms of a man who actually knew how to take charge. She cried, big tears, but her eyes were cold, calculating the exit strategy. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Sophia didn't just cheat. She managed the narrative. Before I even had a chance to process the breakup, she got to our friends first. She posted a cryptic message on social media about toxic relationships and emotional abuse, implying that I had been the one mistreating her. The phone calls and texts started flooding in immediately. Friends I had known for years, people I had supported and helped, were texting me, asking how I could be so cruel to her, telling me that I needed to respect her decision to leave, accusing me of controlling behavior. I was stunned. I tried to tell them the truth, that she had cheated, that I had the proof. But the gaslighting had been going on for 2 years. The ground was already fertile for her lies. They told me I was in denial, that I was trying to smear her name to cover up my own failures. They said it was classic abuser behavior to play the victim. Even Brendan chimed in, sending me a message telling me to leave her alone and accusing me of being obsessed. The isolation was absolute. I lost the girl, I lost the relationship, and I lost my community, all in the span of 48 hours. I was painted as the villain in a story where I was the only one who had actually been loyal. The specific phrase that cut the deepest came through a mutual friend who was trying to mediate. He told me that Sophia felt terrible, but that she had confided in him that she just couldn't respect a man who let himself be disrespected. He said she told him that if I had just put my foot down, if I had just been a man and forbidden her from seeing other guys, she would have listened. But because I was passive, she had no choice but to wander. It was the ultimate victim blaming. She blamed my lack of aggression for her decision to cheat. She had successfully convinced our entire social circle that her infidelity was actually a symptom of my insufficient masculinity. I stood alone in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of her things I was packing, realizing that the world had gone mad. Walking away from Sophia was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the first authentic action I had taken in 2 years. I moved out of the apartment, cutting off all contact with her and the friend group that had so eagerly turned on me. The silence that followed was deafening. For weeks, the loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I missed the good parts, the laughter, the companionship, the feeling of being part of a pair. I caught myself checking my phone, waiting for a text, wanting to explain myself one last time to make them see the truth. But I knew there was no point. You cannot reason with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. In the quiet of my new place, small and simple in mine, I began the slow, painful process of reconstructing my identity. I had to unpack the lies Sophia had fed me. I had to remind myself that being respectful didn't mean being weak. I had to learn that wanting a partner who didn't humiliate me wasn't insecurity. It was a basic standard of self-respect. I realized that her definition of masculinity, being controlling, aggressive, and domineering, wasn't strength. It was toxicity in a different package. I didn't want to be that kind of man. I wanted to be a man who could communicate, who could love without fear, and who could trust without being a fool. The problem wasn't that I wasn't masculine enough. The problem was that I was loving someone who didn't understand what love was. It took months, but the anger began to fade, replaced by a cool, distant clarity. I saw Sophia once from a distance across the street. She was with Brendan. They looked loud, frantic, trying too hard to look happy. She didn't see me. I didn't wave. I didn't feel the urge to run over and confront her. I just watched her for a moment, realizing that she was trapped in her own cycle, constantly needing a new source of drama to feel alive. I felt a wave of pity, but mostly I felt indifference. The experience left scars, of course. It is harder for me to trust now. I look for red flags that I used to ignore. I'm slower to open up, but I am no longer the moon orbiting someone else's sun. I am my own planet now. I learned that respect is not something you earn by changing who you are to please someone else. It is something you command by refusing to be treated as anything less than you deserve. Sophia told me I was the love of her life, just not the one she respected. In the end, I realized that without respect, her love was worthless. And losing a worthless thing isn't a tragedy, it's a liberation. I picked up the pieces of the man she tried to break, and I built myself into someone I could finally respect.